Okay, I hope I can live up to live up to that. Thanks, Marek, for the really generous introduction for this. Thanks also, obviously, to Gregoria, to Barry for hosting this, to all the other Antikytherians that are here who help put all this together, and lots of faces that I haven't seen for a long time, who in one way or another were instrumental to the development of the ideas of this book. And that's really kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about tonight, was sort of where this book came from, some of its own history that we try to, it's not even really my own. It really just belongs to the book. And then to revisit a little bit of maybe the greatest hits of some of the key ideas of the book, and we can see whether they still seem relevant today. Before I start, though, just so I said, how many of you are more or less familiar with the book? If you could just sort of raise your hand. Okay, great. And how many of you not really, not so much? Also fine. Perfect. Half and half. Okay, that's great. Because the lecture that I put together was sort of meant to be both interesting if you actually do know the book and you want to see a little bit of something new, and also we'll sort of go through the basic ideas if you don't know the book and you are a new initiate to it as well. So great. One way in which I tried to sort of talk about this when I was talking about the book when it came out was that it was an attempt to develop something like a theory of totality in the Jamesonian sense of totality. But the real idea here was to try to wrestle with an idea that I ended up calling planetary computation, which was a way of thinking of computation not as just about algorithms or mathematics or code or certain kinds of appliances, but rather as a new kind of planetary infrastructure. What we would later in Antikythera call cognitive infrastructures, a form of information systems that would not only relay information, but were capable of producing and generating information, and as of late, feats of genuine cognition as well. I should say, as Marek said quite eloquently, this was swimming a little bit against the current. The Snow's two-culture dynamic between sciences and humanities parallels very much the kind of theory versus software dynamic that Marek was interested in here as well. And I tried to make the book something that both sides of the camps could recognize as their own, which seemed to work mostly, right? Sometimes when you do this, it ends up, in many ways the book was a kind of Rorschach inkblot. When people would come to me and they would say, I really like the book, and the argument that you make, which was blah, 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 and it's really their argument that they've made. They've generated this in their mind, and that's totally great. That to me, that means it works. There were two big arguments of the book. One was that with the emergence of planetary computation, we're witnessing a kind of a deformation and transformation in modern Westphalian political geography. That the borders and dynamics of nation states were not disappearing by any stretch of the imagination, but were being reconfigured, and we're in competition with another kind of spatialization through platforms. And it's the grinding of the two together that would constitute the basis of the real geopolitics of the future. And again, in 2016, this sounded to people a bit sci-fi, and now I think in many ways is common sense. The other argument was that instead of thinking of planetary computation as a kind of single undifferentiated mega machine in the Lewis Mumford sense, it actually can be understood as more like a network architecture stack, as something that's comprised of functionally defined layers, each with its own kind of modular quasi-autonomy from the others. Obviously, it's a schematic, it's not an engineering document, but it did become useful as a way of thinking about kind of separating these things as individual problems with their own kind of considerations. And so, real quick, then, the Earth layer constitutes the ways in which ecological flows have become sites of intensive sensing and quantification and governance, not to mention where all the energy comes from. Cloud computing spurs platform economics and creates virtual geographies in its own images, consuming obviously a very heavy infrastructure along the way, producing new forms of, as I say, geography in its own images, producing as well rather complex forms of relationship with nation states. Cities become vast discontiguous networks as they weave borders into enclaves and escape routes. Virtual addressing systems locate billions and billions and billions of entities and events into unfamiliar maps. The interface layers present vibrant augmentations of reality, standing in for forms of extended cognition. and then finally a user layer where both human and non-human agents populate and make use of this tangled apparatus, what I call an accidental megastructure that is the stack. So let me unpack a little bit that for you later on. What I wanted to start with, though, was to talk a little bit about where some of the ideas came from this, because it's hopefully an interesting story, but it's a somewhat of an unlikely one. I think some of the ways of thinking about stack systems and kind of overlapping geographies, the ways in which multiple geographies might claim the same site or place or person in a kind of pluralized form, it actually comes from Robert Smithson. I'm thinking through some of Robert Smithson's mapping projects from 1966 and 1971. I did a whole class on these at UCSD, and it got me thinking about different ways of understanding a kind of verticalization of geographic systems. I taught in architecture school for a very long time at SciArc for about 20 years, and Rem Koolhaas's Delirious New York from 1978 was super influential in the way in which he talked about cities as a kind of, he didn't use this terminology, but it's what he was doing, thinking about cities as a kind of platform. And particularly New York City, the way the grid system operated as a kind of an imposition of a kind of autocratic regularity that ultimately becomes a scaffold, like a reef, upon which other forms of life would structure. And the recombinancy of the program within a skyscraper, where you could have totally different things going on the same plot of land, just because by segmenting them in different floors. And this kind of vertical modularity, something clicked for me with this as well. Obviously, things like Stafford Beer's Cybersyn and his ways of thinking about how you could recompose an entire society through a computational system. I mean, those of you, who studied this, Eden Medina's book is like a horribly naive kind of project, but still one that inspires, cybernetic socialism, comes back every 3 years, and always looks at this as kind of some sort of founding thing. But some of it also then came from thinking about generative systems more broadly, and how it is that generative systems, like an algorithm, let's say, produce complex things that don't always repeat themselves. Like there's a kind of contingency and indeterminacy in generative systems. And John Cage's work of generative music was super influential in thinking about those kinds of balances between path dependency and contingency in generativity itself, and the ways of thinking about algorithms that produce different kinds of effects. Or for that matter, Oulipo and the Eulipians in the 1960s would sort of procedural-based literature and poetic experiments, which were algorithms that would be generating a form of literature based on a deterministic rule system, unlike Claude. For example, the Georges Perec book, Avoid, is a book that you may know famously. It's a novel that doesn't use the letter E in the entire novel. That's its primary thing. And I once joked to David Krakauer, the head of the Santa Fe Institute, that writing a novel that doesn't use the letter E is really, really hard. But translating the novel into English that also doesn't use the letter E, that's the guy who's the real hero. And he goes, "Oh, you mean Gilbert Adair? I know him." And this is David's kind of like this, but you get the idea. Now, to the stack, sort of like the actual sort of construct thing, it also comes from a kind of an odd place as well. As I mentioned, I taught at architecture school for a really long time, and there was one class that I did on the thing, on the object, right? And the class was really a kind of critique of Heidegger's notion of the thing, the famous The Thing essays, and like his distinction between thing and object. And it was basically, like a lot of my work, it was like, fuck Heidegger, so we were going to sort of go, we're going to go at one essay at a time. But one of the projects they did was sort of a ripoff of the project of the club, sort of a ripoff of a project that Droge Design, the Dutch design group, did. This would be early 2000s. And it was a project where it was a procedural project, another procedural project, where the idea was that you would take these cups and saucers, but you would basically, like the Eulipians, you would write a rule system for the stacking and gluing together of these cups and saucers. And so they made these like weird towers of stuff. So the assignment that I gave the architecture students was, without telling them this is what they were going to do, was to write a 11-layer stack system, basically, where they first had to write out a functional or descriptive or generative definition of each of the layers. So it'd be like something that is red, something that tastes like grape, something that reminds me of my grandfather, or something like this. And like they would have to write these rule systems. And then I made them make the objects based on these generative rule systems. So they were making little stacks. And architecture school, you can get away with anything. So, and some of them turned out really nice. They're memorable in different sort of ways, and they all had really good stories about them. But you get the idea of this sort of functionally defined layers that actually can produce something unexpected. Like you never would have come up with this as a object in its own right, other than through this kind of like procedurality for this as well. And these, in many ways, was also a kind of another little light bulb that gone on. It's like, oh, actually, the entire economy works this way. This bowl of eggs is the whole economy. So, that's how it works. But in terms of like the comp sci part of this as well, it's really just based on the old OSI network architecture stack, which was was 7 layers instead of 6, and in many respects it was a kind of better idea for stack than TCP/IP. But TCP/IP had the big advantage of it worked just fine with the computers you already had. And so this kind of retroactive adaptation is the kind of as an evolutionary principle was one that I was very interested in kind of exploring, about how existing things can be made into a new system if you glue them together in the right way. If you put a protocol layer between them, you can actually make a new system that didn't exist before. It's actually much better than trying to make one from scratch. I started writing about this much earlier on. I also did my PhD at UC Santa Barbara, was an early version of this idea called software after states. There's a piece I wrote for Theory, Culture, and Society on Google as a geopolitical actor, and framework had to do with the Lashkar-e-Taiba's Mumbai attacks. It's a complicated story. And then I was invited, when I had first come to UCSD, I was invited by, it's a weird story, but I was invited by the US State Department to do a lecture tour of Russia, to talk to them about the future of planetary computation. And so they organized this lecture tour for me where I went to Kazan and Moscow and St. Petersburg and a few other places. And they had organized 2 lectures per day for 7 days in a row. And I was talking to architecture school, the Carnegie Endowment, the political science department of Moscow State, the completely different audiences. So I had a choice. I either had to come up with a talk, I had to either come up with 14 different talks, or I had to come up with one talk that would make everybody interesting, it would work for everybody. And I chose the latter. So the talk had to do with sort of beginning to think about this idea of trying to make an argument about the architecture of planetary computation. And in the talk, I had this idea called the QCAR stack, which stands, I'm not even going to tell you what it stands for, but the idea was you could actually, if you think about it, you had cloud systems and ubiquitous computing systems, interface systems, the whole structure of planetary computation is a kind of little stack. And I had written 3 versions of the manuscript at this point that was sort of become a book, and this QCAR stack idea was a little footnote in the last little part of it, but I found myself repeating it over and over again as a line to people when I explained to them what the book was about. And then I realized, oh shit, that's the book. I have to rewrite the entire thing. And so I did. And that went through another 2 or 3 different rounds of sort of realizing that actually it was just a stack system and I can refactor the whole thing. So an earlier version of this had network as one of the layers on this as well, though I kind of ran out of time. And so I pulled it out, and that's mostly the reason why there's only 6. A book proposal to Doug Sari at MIT Press. Hello, Doug, if you're watching. The story with, Doug, I love Doug. He's the reason he got the book through to do this 500-page hard copy book with MIT Press from someone who'd never done a big book before. It's all because of Doug. But it was also kind of one of these things where I talked him into it one night, and then talked to him a few days later, and he didn't remember me talking him into it. So I had to sort of tell him oh no, you agreed to this. We're totally doing it. And it worked. So also this time I was going around doing lots of talks on this idea, not just in Russia. Oh, I should also say in Russia, while I was on this trip in Russia, I was staying at the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, and the breakfast place at Metropole Hotel was this giant room, maybe 5 times larger than this, with this huge banquet table, and there's 3 people in there. There's me, this giant guy who looks like the fat guy from the Monty Python movie who blows up, and Rem Koolhaas. And I go up to Rem. It's I knew Rem a little bit from, we had a mutual friend named Renee Dalder. And I said, Rem, funny to meet you here. Oh, and Rem and this very frightened looking intern kid sitting next to him from OMA. And I said, Rem, I haven't seen, like, what are you doing in Moscow? And he said, like, I'm trying to open a new architecture school, but this guy fucked up the presentation. Like, the kid turns green. It turns out that school that he was opening was Strelka, which later becomes part of the story later on. So one of once sort of the ideas had come together, the manuscript was delivered. Daniel Van Velde and Binka and I from Metahaven did a keynote at Transmediala in 2014, where a talk I did called The Black Stack, because they had a book called Black Transparency that was coming out, and I had a book called The Stack was coming out, and we'd like, we'll call it The Black Stack. That would be the name of the panel. Presented this, and this was also the first version of the diagram that Daniel had made for this was shown there as well. Our friend Julieta Aranda from eFlux was in the audience. She said, this is great, we want to publish it, which became the Black Stack essay, which was, then I had to retroactively come up with an idea of like why my essay was called Black Stack, even though it was meant to be half Metahaven, but this is the way it goes. Tiziana Terranova was there as well, and she had a book that came out before my book that was about my book called Red Stack Attack, which is also like a certain kind of accomplishment. And then, as Barry mentioned, I spoke here at Gray Area Foundation. This is a screenshot of the exact my exact lecture. I think I'm wearing the same pants that I did in 2016. Okay, then the books comes out in 2016, and as you recall, 2016 was very weird. This was Trump's first press conference after he was elected. It was him and Don King waving these giant, this handful of flags, and they're asking about like Russian interference, and he comes up with this like clock is right, broken clock right twice a day, kind of thing, which eventually I use as a lecture title. The whole age of computer has made it, so I mentioned like in many ways the book was successful in becoming a kind of a Rorschach inkblot in which people, you could study, you could go deep. I think the argument rewards careful reading, but it also works, I think, in such a way as to where, like, if you kind of get it at an abstract level and you start making use of the idea in different ways, you can turn the idea into something that I didn't intend, but is still really good. And I think that's what books should do. Some of the ways in which, and this is really about Metahaven, it's not about me, that the book itself and the diagram and the thing became a kind of meme that would go around and sort of mean something even beyond the arguments themselves, which I'll show you in a little bit. I also want to say is like, Daniel, we also had an idea for 3 covers of the book. There was going to be a black cover and like a very rare red cover. So it was going to be like half the white one, half the black one, and like if you were super special, you got the red one. And MIT Press said like, there's no way. We're already spending so much money on this book, you guys can forget it. But there were some alternative covers that sort of went around in different sorts of ways. I think we picked the right one. But just to show you a little bit of like, alternative histories of things that might not have been. One of the first talks I did after the book came out was also with Metahaven was a talk for the Premsella lecture, which is this big prestigious lecture in Amsterdam that Metahaven did these buttons for. They did the whole production design, and it's brilliantly, it's one of like the best designed lectures I've ever seen, and it's all them, and it's really, really great. But they did these little buttons on it, which then became, we don't know why, became part of this like fashion photo shoot that people picked up, and it went to different sort of places. People started, very attractive people started wearing these buttons for reasons I don't, it's fine with me. People started also then taking pictures of the book, right? The book became kind of like me and the stack. My copy of the stack, right, was a thing, right? And people posing with the book. This was like people saying really slightly not safe for work things about the book. This as well. And then there was also sort of an Instagram, a little genre of sort of stack still lifes. Stack with my everyday, stack with a martini. That sort of reading with, or stack at 420 with the other things as well, or people built, like rearranging their house so they could read the stack in a better sort of way. or redesigning the diagram itself, like putting the network back in. This, I don't know where this came from, but great. Or sort of occult interpretations of the stack that people come up with, or very occult interpretations of the sort of you know, a bit CCRU sort of thing as well. Sure. On this, but then, you know, like anything that becomes sort of mimetic, then there's like a there's a backlash to the whole sort of thing, and so you also get stuff like this from this, or like this. Thanks to new models. If you're watching, you know, love you guys. We'll talk soon. There became a fake Bratton Instagram account that somebody made, which had all sorts of stuff in it as well. But yeah, like, you know, Joshua, who we also did a talk with him recently, you know, been supporter of this. It became, somebody made it like, okay, it's like part of the Joshua Cinderella kit. You get, like when you buy these pants, you get the book and the rest of it as well. Or maybe this one, a kind of product tie-in that didn't happen. Or for example, this one, Kai Reaver, who's an architect who was in that class at SciArt, who did the weird sculpture, sent me this one from the mean streets of Geneva, where he found this as well. And then lastly, you know, people started getting a little more cosmic with the whole thing around this as well. And this is great. I love all this. So please, you know, make use of it in some interesting way. It inspired a different range of art projects, which is, you know, as I should say, is the first audience for the book really was the kind of art and design world. Like, they were the only people who kind of took it seriously. Like, you know, now I get emails from people in IR departments and political science departments who want me to come and talk to them about all of this. But, you know, back then they thought this was all stupid. But it really was the art and design people who said, like, yeah, this is it. But then you started seeing it in different kind of places around this as well. And then, like, about 2 weeks after the book was published, there was one of the Snowden leaks that came out way late, that Der Spiegel published. And as soon as it came out, I got like 50 people one morning sent me this PowerPoint slide that they found in the Snowden leaks, saying, the NSA are stack theorists too, and they almost got it right, and they did. It is kind of weirdly similar. So anyway, that's a little bit about the afterlife of the book. What I wanted then, so that's sort of for people who already know the book. For people who don't know the book, now it's your turn. I want to talk a little bit about just a sort of primer of what's going on with these 6 layers. Which is thus. And so in many ways, the book is it's basically this diagram and a 500-page caption is the book. The first part, though, before I get into the stack layers, is this long discussion of the idea of nomos. And for any of you who went to Peter Thiel's Carl Schmitt lectures, you may have heard this term before. Schmitt's obviously super dubious character, but the idea is very interesting. What nomos refers to is the way in which a political system decides to carve up the world in order to make jurisdiction, to make space that is mine versus yours. And it could do this in many ways. One of which it can draw lines on the land and say, okay, on this side of the line is France, and on that side of the line is Germany. Or on this side of the line is United States, and on that side of the line is Mexico. But what it doesn't tend to do is to say, okay, this side, we're just to carve up the water. But it could, but it didn't, at least at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, where this idea sort of becomes codified. Or now recently it starts to sort of cut up the electromagnetic spectrum and say this part of the electromagnetic spectrum is the United States, this part is Canada, and so forth and so on. This particular logic of the nomos of circumscribed land, not air, not sea, but land, as I say, sort of gets codified in 1648 Treaty of Westphalia. And what it implies is the other part of nomos is then what is the geopolitical architecture that emerges from this fundamental decision about how to divide up space. What Westphalia did is it divided up land only into these loops, these contiguous loops. I will demonstrate the loops here. Every loop gets a flag, a currency, a World Cup team, and so forth. It becomes the sort of the demand of sovereignty. The thing is that states and markets don't necessarily work this way. And part of the argument about the book is also that platforms work differently than companies. They work differently than markets. They work differently than states. They have a different kind of dynamic. They have a different kind of spatial orientation. They support themselves in different ways. Whereas markets, the corporations support themselves through transactions, platforms support themselves through the rationalization of information that they mediate, which is a different kind of economy that Marek's book talks about very convincingly. The other thing that sort of comes out is then right after the book came out was a talk I did in Berlin, where at this point it had become very, very clear, same place I did the transmedial talk, that planetary computation was very quickly breaking into kind of segmenting or breaking into different polities of a US stack, a China stack, an EU stack, India stack, and now they even use the terms, which I called hemispherical stacks at that time, which is now one of our Antikythera's research areas. And the idea was basically this, is that what we're seeing is that the multipolarization of geopolitics and the multipolarization of planetary computation not only track each other, they're actually the same thing. That as governance with a small g moves into the imminence, the sort of the imminence of technological systems, not the abstract realm of law and discourse, but into the actual ways in which technical systems organize people in place and space, that the ability to build a stack is the same thing as the ability to build a society. And so it is no surprise then that the geopolitical competition would be over all the necessary means, from data to minerals, by which you would do this. On the China stack, by the way, another book that also just came out that I co-edited with Anna Greenspan and Amy Ireland and Bogna Conyer was based on some time I spent in China as a visiting professor at NYU Shanghai. And it's a book that still, I find this still remarkable because we conceived this book a long time ago. It's still, as far as I know, the only English language book on the history of AI in China, which is a really weird and interesting history. And I recommend this if you want like a little bit of an introduction to the China stack. The big one, though, in terms of like what's happened since the book came out on the Nomos thing is that in many ways the stack I described is over. That the era of procedural deterministic programming and the kinds of infrastructures that are necessary for this are very, like sort of Theseus' ship, are very, very quickly getting replaced by a different kind of stack. That may look similar in some ways, but really doesn't operate in the same way. And so this is sort of the big shift. So let me go through, nevertheless, having said that it's all irrelevant, let me go through then the six layers real quick, and then we can get to the good stuff, which will be the discussion with you all. First argument to make is that I argue that computation was discovered as much as it was invented, that computation is part of how complex natural systems conjugate themselves. And what we take as computation is really artificial computation. But computation is like light bulbs are not electricity. Our computers are not computation. The second key idea from this chapter is that the ways in which at this point in time, again, think about 10 years ago, the ways in which we taught ourselves to think about digital is to virtual as analog is to physical is totally wrong. That the digital systems are just as heavy and weighty and material as any kind of analog system, which all the sort of controversies about electricity use in data centers make quite clear. And that what we call the cloud and what we call AltSec itself is a geophysical folding of the Earth itself into little bit of forms. The stack terraforms its host planet, picking out little bits of minerals and structures which it folds in these intricately ingenious sorts of ways into the glowing glass rectangles that we hold in our hand, all of which contain little bits of Africa. We all carry around bits of Africa with us as well. Computation in this form is a geophysical fact. But it's also in this way, then, as I said, the Earth itself becomes kind of like an object of knowledge, not only the source of this as well. Sometimes when people ask me something along the lines of, like, what contribution can the stack make to solving climate change? And I usually start by reminding them is like the only reason we know climate change is happening at all is because of the satellites and sensors, and most importantly, the supercomputing simulations of the past, present, and future that allow us to model the scenarios that we're all concerned about. The concept of climate change itself, and then by secondary fact, the concept of the Anthropocene, is an epistemological accomplishment of planetary computation. That capacity for systemic self-reflection. What we see then, in terms of the geopolitical computation is a different kind of mineral determinism, fighting over different kinds of resources and access to different things. A kind of mineral deterministic geopolitics is nothing new, but it works in a different sort of way now, and very quickly will work as from everything from photonic chips to alternative battery infrastructures. It'll shift very quickly again. But we also see ways in which this is not only using a lot of energy, it's also driving transformations in energy infrastructures. Some indications suggest that this rush may, for example, provide the much-needed economic incentive for finally the deployment of things like next-generation nuclear power, a development that in of itself would carry lots of historical ironies. Among them, the idea this is everything we're talking about is being driven by video games, of course. Fortnite drives GPU development, which drives AI, which drives nuclear power, which drives planetary clean energy. So video games save the world. This, by the way, this little paper comes from a little book called Accept All Cookies, which we did for the Venice Biennale earlier this year. It is available on our website if you'd like to go through it. It's sort of little pithy aphorisms, if you like, of Antikythera think. Another project, just a little pitch here, that as Marek mentioned, I'm also a researcher in a group at Google called Paradigms of Intelligence, which is the group that is developing Project Suncatcher, which is Google's version of the orbital data center, which is a way in which you can see planetary computation moving into extraplanetary computation, which I think is overdue. And I obviously can't talk too much about the design, but I will say that it's a lot smarter than gluing an H100 to a Starlink satellite. Okay, to the cloud layer. I'll try to go quickly so we can get to this as well. The cloud is not numinous. It is a specific and vast infrastructure. It produces and constructs different kinds of geographies in its own image, making different things central and decentralized according to the ways in which it folds space, not according to Westphalian nomos, because it becomes a different kind of dynamic. It's located not only in the cities, but most importantly in rural areas. The data centers that are really the factories of the present day are oftentimes outside the city, that they constitute a different kind of center, if you like. Where we live is in fact arguably the peripheral place. There's also then ways in which this cloud dynamic, as I said, sort of has this grinding effect between cloud platforms and nation states. The example I talked about in this book was this curious episode from 2010 where somebody at Google Maps accidentally, I assume, moved the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica. And Nicaragua mobilized their troops to take the new land that Google had bequeathed them. And Costa Rica made a few phone calls and everything, cooler heads prevailed. But the idea that you would have a private platform that would be deciding the fundamental description of geography, and then nation states would be kind of like just another user of this truth referent, to me represented a kind of like, okay, this is a new world. As I said, one of the ways I think that some of the cloud stuff was a little bit misunderstood, I was not making the argument that somehow clouds dissolve the state. It was actually both, like in many ways, cloud platforms do and did take on many of the functions of the modern state. Identity, currency, geography, as I just indicated. But just as much, states evolve in relationship to what they can see and sense. And so at the same time, states have evolved into something like cloud platforms as well. And it's the binding, sort of twisting, double helix torsion between these two folds that is our moment. It is also then, where sovereignty gets sorted out, where the ability of states to claim the sovereignty to produce data over different people or places or things or processes is not only something that is a kind of a manifestation of the claim of sovereignty. It's in many ways it's becoming the central claim in ways itself. All of which, as I say, is sort of imminent in the small g governance of the technical systems itself. It is not necessarily something that is remotely amenable to the kind of discursive, legalistic, we're just going to sort this out and write a law and everything will be okay kinds of approaches that Europe is so fond of. But one of the interesting, speaking of the AI stack, like one of the things I think is also quite interesting in terms of the way this is playing out for AI is the ways in which as we saw a couple weeks ago with Anthropic in the Defense Department, is some of the ways in which, or if you've ever tried to ask DeepSeek about Tiananmen Square, for example, is the ways in which different kinds of, let's say, hemispherical stack encapsulated models are strategically lobotomized towards particular kinds of worldviews. Now, in the long run, this may produce a kind of generative Galapagos type effects where you have, this is ontological diversity between these different kinds of approaches. At the same time, you see, it's not hard to understand all the ways in which this kinds of censoriousness can go very, very wrong, which is also why, the role of open models, personal fine-tuned models, I think is really important. I did a keynote for Prime Intellect a couple of days ago where I tried to make this point more vociferously. Okay, to the city layer. Moving our eyes slightly higher, and here's where we see, this is Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, by the way, the first city, the oldest city we sort of found was actually for hunter-gatherers. The idea of cities not as a site of encapsulation, but rather as a medium of throughput point for bodies to move through. Then only later becomes about sedentary social forms is I think a key idea, and one in which the way in which our kind of more contemporary nomadic and mobile ways of dealing with cities is actually closer to. But for quite some time, the cities have become, and again, sort of nothing new, they are media. They are sites of concentration of information production and the relay of information production themselves, becoming enclaves and exclaves by which we move through and structure these things as well, touching the stack at the level of urban fabric. It is also, as I suggested in some ways as well, where a lot of the crucial infrastructure is housed, where it's urban, and the base becomes the basis by which urban space is partitioned into different forms of enclosure and distribution. One of the key ideas, though, of the concept of platform sovereignty from the book is that, like urban systems, these are interfaces that don't necessarily care about the legal status of the person, for example. Like the button that you pushed across the street here doesn't care whether you're a citizen or not. Platforms are available to users not only regardless of whether they're a citizen or not, they're available to whether they're not even a human necessarily. This is what I mean by the platform sovereignty. Like the space of agency, of participation in the platform system is quite different than it would be in a market or state system. And there's a kind of suffrage that is imminent and available in this. It's actually also, I think, part of why some of the confusion that states have about how to handle some of this. The city layer is also where AI is becoming embodied. We're used to think of AI as a kind of anthropomorphic voice on the phone, but it's really vastly distributed across urban systems. We live in not only in a software envelope, but increasingly within and amongst a landscape scale distribution of cognitive infrastructures. AI is embodied as the city in different ways, not necessarily as humanoid, but as other sorts of forms, and we are encapsulated within this sort of distributed embodiment. Some of them exhibit what Jakob von Uexküll would call a kind of very complex little weird forms of what he calls an Umwelt, of a sort of a life world. Different sensors sense and are being in the world in different kinds of ways. They may just trigger in a simple sense like Deleuze's allegory of the tick, or they may be more complicated of seeing and smelling and motion and the rest of this. But it's an active ecology by which sensing and intelligence can become closely coupled. As we wander around within this, the Homo sapiens with glowing glass rectangles in our hand, which itself contains a whole battery of sensory capacities. At this point, you have more neurons in your palm than you do in your skull. And the sense and the most complex sensory capacities are just like they're concentrated in your skull, they're also concentrated in your palm. But there's a different battery of sensory capacities. And this is also then obviously part of this interface layer. What I'm speaking, of course, is what we call the exosomatic organ known as the phone, which in its presence as an invasive species then suggests the emergence of other kinds of evolutionary responses, like the appearance of those weird square black flowers that you scan with your phone to pay for things at restaurants. They are a kind of like the surfaces respond to the presence of the phone with cameras as a way of soliciting the exchange of funds in the form of the QR code. We also see ways in which the cities are divided, increasingly not just for us. Especially if you're thinking of this as a kind of regional planning scale, I'm thinking of the data centers that I showed you in the rural areas, what we call human exclusion zones, whether inside the factory or outside the factory, becoming an increasingly important way in which cloud mega-regionalization as a spatial strategy becomes instantiated. It also implies a very different kind of architecture, a very different kind of a way of inhabiting space. Within those factories are also a kind of little mini city populated by ever more sensate and intelligent robotics, some of them not even requiring natural light. And so, no humans are left to necessitate such luxuries as visible light illumination. But back where people live, as the determination of the city layer by the cloud layer becomes more intensified, utopian plans are not surprisingly drawn up for some new kinds of polities that might be predicated on the affordances of the cloud, from various forms of dispositional coherence or discontiguous communities in relationship to this as well, as I anticipate here. To the address layer. Swirling just above the city layer is the address layer where any little instance, singular or plural, of matter, particle, or wave, potentially identified by a singular massive addressing system, IPv6, IPv4, and so on, that becomes the linking tool by which Avogadro's number of addresses is available to any one of us to identify things to which and from which information might be sent. Because for something to appear to the stack, it must be addressable. Just like for a letter to arrive at a building, that building must have an address. But some entity or hyacity, a noun or a verb, has to have an addressable coherence for it to be something to which information can be sent or received. Now, in terms of what's happened to the address layer since the stack has sort of been perfect, one of it is that it's become the basis of a whole, I never would have predicted this, but a whole kind of space in which all the cool kids would move to Berlin and work on avant-garde accounting apps in the form of blockchain. But if you think about it, writing begins with accounting, right? Sumerian cuneiform was all about he sold this chicken to somebody else. So the idea that somehow writing, language would begin with accounting once again, maybe is not so surprising. But this proliferation of digital tokens, which are really what? They're ways of sort of addressing something and saying this is a thing that is now transferable, is all about what I meant by this concept of deep address in the chapter, the identification of a discrete entity that becomes something that can participate in this kind of dynamic, which then motivates any number of other actors to kind of politicize these protocols and become the basis by which something can and cannot be addressable, or the terms by which it's addressable, by which you get, for example, cut off from banking. But beyond finance and the scale and production of that kind of data, tokenization obviously is the central function of the ways in which artificial intelligence knows the world. To tokenize something is sort of parallel with the assignment of an address in one way, with the addressable vector space of the model itself. So in this context, an address is not an inert signifier, but it's an active indexical function in its own right. And ultimately, the structure of addressability itself determines what can be made into data, how it's produced. That which becomes a token, that which does not become a token, the tokenized versus the non-tokenized is the visible versus the invisible, that which can speak and that which cannot. At the interface layer has always been, in many ways, perhaps the most psychologically rich point of contact between the user peering into the stack and the stack peering back up out to the user. We, of course, come up with a sort of very rich interface to the world, not a paw, but an extensible grasping entity called the hand, which we then turn into a sort of axiosomatic grasping organ, which allows us to grasp and point and click on things that we see in a virtual screen space. And indeed, we've all sort of grown up as a kind of button-pushing species. We learn the concept of sort of agency at a distance. If I click this button, the light turns on and off, or the fan turns on and off. This is my son Lucian, who's now going to college in the fall, and he's going to kill me when he finds out that I showed this picture of him. in here as well. So hopefully he won't find out until he's up for a while. During this particular moment, like a particular genre of interface becomes dominant, which is the GUI. And the GUI is weird in the sense to which, like in the history of images, it's a representation of a system. It's a diagrammatic representation of a system, but unlike a diagrammatic representation of a system, if you click on this diagram, the thing that the diagram diagrams will actually happen, right? So in information visualization, I've got like a nice map of this thing, but it's just a map. But for an interface, if I click on the word bomb, bombing happens. And so the interface becomes like the diagram turned into a technology. But it's also, if you look at the history of sort of the mechanical interfaces that we use to manipulate complex technologies, the GUI is innovation in which like those interfaces become visual images, right? Like early computers were, of course, not visual images, or early industrial tools were based on controls that were not images. So it's this convergence of the history of the mechanical control and the image and of language ultimately into something that has a kind of performativity in the literal sense of this term. To click the button becomes the thing. Now, the other thing we sort of talked about in the book is the ways in which certain kinds of genres of interface become what I call the interfacial regimes. They become ways of modeling and constructing the world. Because interfaces themselves, as diagrams, only work to the extent to which they are successful map reductions. Like the Borges story goes, you don't want a map of the city that has everything in the city on it. The useful map of the city is the one that gets rid of 99.9% of the things that are in the city and leaves you only with this essential topology, essential arrangement and dispositions. And of course, this is why you can make many different maps of the same city. The same thing for a GUI interface. You've got a Turing-complete processor in your phone, but you don't want to write your own printer drivers, but you also, what the interface does, it takes all the universal space of possibility and reduces it to 9 things that you can do. This is the map reduction problem of the interface. It also then implies, in the same way in which deciding what to map or not map is an ideological proposition, all GUIs are in themselves the same form, same kind of ideological proposition. Okay, already talked about this. The touch and poke interactions that we give a kind of a sense of volume and sequence to what are obvious. This, by the way, is these soccer players playing soccer. They're watching themselves play football in the VR while they're playing the football and trying to kind of map. Here, we see it again. They're trying to map their location to what they're seeing here as well. They are us. In many ways, as we move around the city trying to sort of like locate ourselves in relationship to the interfacial regime's production of this as well, we also find ourselves in many ways of struggling for the map and the territory to merge in some kind of way. The most extreme example of this then would be augmented reality, as we call it, which is forever 5 years off. A deeply granular and pervasive, form of embodied perception and gestures that produce what would previously be called psychotic hallucinations, but are now, in fact, a consumer platform. In hopefully the best possible. I don't mean that in a derogatory way whatsoever. Like I love this stuff. My ultimate fear, though, for AR is less about the killer app as marketing, but rather the killer app of AR is something like fundamentalist religion. That when you have the capacity to, it's one thing to tell people, so like, here's the principles by which you should live. And then you need to interpret these principles and apply them to something that's happening right in front of you to know how to interpret it. It's very different when the thing that you're perceiving is pre-interpreted for you as friend or enemy, as halal or haram, or good or bad, or them or us. And it's sort of this direct indexical labeling of things that makes me concerned in terms of sort of the interfacial regime dynamics of this as well. But again, sometimes really things that seem really bad and weird turn out to be amazing. So who knows? There's other ways in which interface culture has become a kind of theater, if you like, where you're presented with an interface. The interface implies that you have some sort of control, or that the control of you is at least present with you when in fact it's not. So for example, when you go to the airport and you're confronted by the man who is checking your passport and sizing you up, It seems like in the Kafka story that this guy is deciding whether you shall pass or not, but in fact, of course, he's not. He's just scanning your passport. The database out in rural Maryland is deciding whether thou shalt pass or not, and then he just pushes the button and says, yeah, you can come in or not. So really what this gateway, this interface is deciding upon is not you. It's your digital shadow that lives in that data center in Maryland. It's your digital shadow that gets to come in or not get to come in, and then you are just sort of the vehicle of the decision. Now, of late, then, this movement between the simulation of the real and the virtual and the real that comes within the interface starts with different kinds of directions. Most people's first encounter with what we call artificialized intelligence is through this very thin little peephole of chat, as a way in which users sort of experience this. And as prompting becomes more elaborate, that simple window perhaps will become more resilient and flexible in different kinds of ways, one hopes, than just the kind of chat buddy. By the way, as Marek talked a little bit about in terms of agents, the next Android Theory Studio, we're quite famous for our research studios, is going to be on agents, and it's going to be here in San Francisco. And so I will let you know, we'll keep posted on that, and perhaps you can participate. Okay, last, the user layer. That's us, the cockroaches. The generic universality of platforms makes them formally open to all users, human and non-human alike. Anything that can manipulate the interface layer to activate something at the address layer within the city layer that sends something to the cloud layer, draw in the pace layer, can be a user. The system doesn't care. We have produced a subject position of agency that is agnostic as to whether or not you're human or not. And this, in fact, in some ways is part of, I think, some of the anxiety that is pervasive, some of the ontological unease that's the basis of some of the softer, hard versions of the Butlerian jihad that it feels like it's closing in. Because the user can be animal, vegetable, or mineral. As in security discourse, you either have to be something, know something, or have something. You can be yourself, like your fingerprint. You can know something like your passport, or have something like your key card. Anything that can be, have, or know, which is a lot of things, can be a user. This then requires a different kind of recalibration, if you like, of the political subject, and what we mean by the relationship between subjectivity and agency in relationship to the accidental megastructure in which we are all constituted, because the position of agency is itself not exclusively human, which causes, as I say, a lot of anxiety, including what we might call the emergence of, and I talked about this in 2015, of humanist exceptionalism, which we can, a form of pushback against this dynamic that may be as fervent as it is sometimes irrational. The example that I talked about in the book was based on a visit that I did to Google X a long time ago when the book was being written. And I was, they were just started a Google driverless car project back then. And I was asking them, basically, you guys must get some weird correspondence about what you're doing. People must have a very funny, weird ideas about where this is going. And they said, oh, let me show you this. And they went in the other room and they come back and they got this a letter, which was a letter from some lawyer with this big heading at the top, is notice of intention of legal action, which is, of course, means nothing. But it was from the lawyer of a group called Gun Owners of America, which is a little bit to the right of the NRA. And they had announced that should any laws be passed that would make it illegal for a human to drive a car, that they would seek to have automobiles reclassified as munitions and therefore subject to the Second Amendment. And therefore you can't, you'll take my Corvette from my cold, dying fingers. So your life may be ended by someone encased in a 2-ton steel box careening down the asphalt vista trying to prove a point about how technology will never capture their natural humanity. But more broadly, I think we see a wider space of what I call God of the gaps humanism, what Leif Weatherby calls remainder humanism, but it's basically the same idea. And that is, from the Turing test, which I think, Turing was, deserves to be on the 1-pound note, but there's still something unfortunate about the way in which it sets up our understanding of AI. is a sort of, first of all, it models intelligence as something that is encased in a particular single human mind rather than the distribution of minds. But it also sets it up as a kind of either-or dynamic. Like, the AI is something that would replace the human or stand in for the individual human. And like the decision is either, is it AI or is it not AI? Like, it's a zero-sum kind of dynamics. And what we see then is a sort of, we've all sort of seen sort of like, oh, well, AI will never beat someone at chess, beat someone at chess. No, it'll never beat someone at Go, beat someone at Go. AI, blah, 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 blah. It'll never do protein folding, does protein folding. Never write a novel better than me, writes a novel better than me. The God of the gaps was an old argument that sort of implied that, like, we had ideas of what God did, and then as science progressed, it was like, okay, well, God doesn't make the waves, but he does make the sun coming up. Then we figure out how the sun comes up. It's like, okay, well, he doesn't make the waves or the sun coming up, but he still makes babies. And then we figure out DNA. Okay, so he doesn't make babies. So the space of God gets increasingly small. The thing is, we set up our own relationship with AI in the same way. If we think about it, so like everything that AI can do is everything that humans can do that AI can't do is what humans are. That the essentialness of humans is all the things that AI can't do. The little square in which we're going to sort of stand is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. It's the wrong setup. Yeah, God of the gaps, humanism. Okay, wrapping this up. The user layer is arguably then where most of the transformation over the past decade, both in kind and quantities of actors, has produced. And I'll reiterate, the user is not simply a kind of needs-having human in the human-centered design sense, but an active function within a larger system. The user is any agent that can manipulate the interface layer and receive purposeful signals up and down the stack layers. For example, the way in which the India stack has codified ID as the basis of its sort of structure around this as well. In 2016, that framework of the sort of non-human agent user was a much more hypothetical than it is today. Today, we have many robots running on multimodal models, navigating complex spatial environments, completing tasks with intricate dexterity. They are the citizens of the factories and warehouses and surgical theaters and farms and, of course, planet Mars and sooner many other places. So as the human population continues its modernity-driven decline in the coming years, the ratio of human to humanoids, or at least humans to agents, will shift dramatically. It's all but certain that human-level minds will be far outnumbered by non-human human-level minds in the form of agentic AI. And in this moment, the status, like, what do we even mean by a society, becomes open for debate. All of these co-occupy the user layer with us. Sometimes we occupy these with other users at the same time. These are the pluralization dynamics at play here. These are a lot of changes to take in. It's a lot to process. It's disorienting. And this enemy encourages reactionary anxiety and subcultures of backlash. It does so because it delinks human subjectivity, or we have learned to understand human subjectivity, from the distributions of agency in which it tries to act on the world. These become delinked. This Copernican trauma of understanding the way we thought we were a subject and agent is in fact not the way we actually are a subject or agent. Trauma is the right word. It comes from Freud. Copernican trauma comes from Freud, by the way. Okay, last little bit. Stack to come, from internet to cognitive infrastructures. Looking to the next decade, it will be composed of a different stack, one built by and for AI. What your parents called the internet will evolve into cognitive infrastructures. Infrastructures that not only transmit and circulate information, they themselves are generative of intelligence and participate in society accordingly. How much? A conversation I had several months ago with an astrophysicist at Stanford got me thinking. She made the point, we were talking about the role of simulation in complex science and how everything is really about like running the highest degree computational simulations as a way of figuring things out. And I asked her, would you have enough compute to, is there enough compute on Earth to solve dark energy? Was my question to her, to run a simulation that would necessarily solve it. She said, no, she thought about it, was like, no, we need more, we need like, I don't know, 10 times more than we actually have if you ran it all at once. But it got me thinking, like, okay, how much is there? like, okay, 10 years of talking about planetary computation, how much planetary computation is there? Now, clearly, there's more now than there was in 2020. There's more in 2020 than there was in 2010. There's more in 2010 than there was in 1950. More in 1950 than there was in 1650. But how much? Okay, so after a lot of napkin sketching and late-night arguments with Gemini and Claude, I have a rough estimate for you, and that is 10 to the 23 flops, or 1 zeta flop. If you measure it in flops, and I don't think flops is the right, Guillaume told me the other day, we had to cook just such a I actually don't think flops is the right measurement, but just for the sake of artificial computation, 2026, 1 zeta flops. We could say that's 1 PCU, 1 unit of planetary computation. The thing is, it's doubling roughly every 30 months. And with the big build out, it's maybe going faster, which if that holds, we would be at twice as much as we have now in about 2.5 years. 10 times what we have now in about 6 years, and 100 times what we have in about 16 years. And what 100x planetary compute world looks like, we don't know. But there's a real question. There's like, how do you power such a thing? I mentioned that I'm sort of like a kind of peripheral observer member of the Suncatcher team, which is based on a lot of conversations with Blaise about Kardashev scale and all the rest of this. Like, the idea of extraplanetary computation, obviously, it's not Elon's thing. It goes back to Olaf Stapleton's 1937 at least, right? Like, this has been in the air for a really long time, Dyson spheres and all the rest of this stuff. But one of the things we're also working on there is an idea that Kardashev scale is just too blunt. Kardashev scale measures how much energy a civilization can take in, but that's not really enough. What you really want to measure is how much computation is a planetary civilization capable of. And we sort of ran a lot of the numbers, and we were like, oh, turns out this lines up really well with all the intelligence explosions, like Maynard-Smith and Smith-Marzi sort of like intelligence explosion scaffolding system. And so we've got a paper coming out that makes a new argument and updates the Kardashev scale. So there you go. We have a program called Antikythera. Many of our members here are sort of key people here tonight. The program was set up to try to answer this question. If the stack was about what planetary computation is, Antikythera is about what planetary computation is for, which is not a descriptive question, it's a normative question. The argument, if you start going back to this idea of like the idea of climate change and ultimately Anthropocene as an effect of planetary computation, it's those kinds of moments of Copernican trauma, of disclosure, of the emergence of forms of planetary sapience that I think are really what it's all about. But each time this is successful, whether it's in neuroscience or genomics or chemistry or something else, these are all little mini Copernican traumas, because they all use computation as what Stanislaw Lem, I'm quoting Bogna Konya here, calls an existential technology. For Stanislaw Lem, in the amazing book Summa Technologica, which if you haven't read, you must, his major nonfiction book, he says there's instrumental technologies, which are those that their primary impact on the world is as a tool. Like bulldozers move dirt fast, and so you can build cities faster. There's a rarer form of technology, which he calls existential technologies, which are those that when you use them right, they change how we understand how the universe works. Microscopes, telescopes, but clearly computation is also an existential technology. That's what it's for. So the name of the organization, as you probably surmise, is named after the Antikythera mechanism, why? Because it's a bit of an abracadabra secret code word, but also because this probably apocryphally identified first computer was not only a calculation device, it was also an astronomical device. It mapped and modeled the movement of the stars and the planets. And so the idea that computation begins with orienting intelligence in relationship to its planetary condition, that's the primal scene that we want, that's the thread we want to pull on to the present. And so that's what we do. You can go, if you want, just last little bit of this is an ad, you can go to our Substack. It's got a little bit of the manifesto there. We also publish a journal with MIT Press, which is quite lovely, I think. We publish books, What is Intelligence, Blaise Aguirre-Yockers's book on lessons from AI about evolution, computing, and minds has won all sorts of awards. Very nice for our first book in the book series. As mentioned, we're also doing the Agent World Studio here in San Francisco later in the year. And I'll end with this. My P doom is actually very low. My P weird is very, very high. And when the going gets weird, adaptation means upping one's tolerance for ambiguity and abstraction. That, if I can give you one piece of advice to young people, it would be this. Okay, if you're interested in knowing more about what we're up to now, this QR code works. You can also just go to antikythera.org, link.antikythera.org. You can follow me on X, where you get my late night missives and around this as well. And with that, I thank you very much. So I think they're going to bring some chairs up for us, Marek, and then we can have at it. And he and I will talk a little bit, and then we will. If I could get a little bit of water, I would be most appreciative of that. Okay.
Let's do it. I like the more austere black background. That's great. So we're talking about the AI stack to come. I feel like that would be a good thing to meditate on for a little bit. A lot of the kind of topological or relationship management or connection management that happens in the stack that you describe lives in a kind of network land, right? We talk a lot about networks in the stack. And right. Kaylato McDowell has like a really nice kind of way of thinking about the kind of process through which these interconnections have changed over the years. We went to network land, and now we're kind of in embedding land.
That's a vector space.
Vector space,
it's
exactly.
A vector space instead of a network space. Yeah, for sure.
And so I'm wondering, like,
just different addressability dynamics, a whole deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
Centralization, decentralization dynamics work differently. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, I guess my question is, like, first, we're talking about the AI stack to come. How many layers does the AI stack to come have?
I don't know.
You don't know? Okay, great. What are the chances that it has one layer?
I don't know that stack is. I don't know if stack is even really the right framework for it as well. I'm sort of undecided on that. It obviously has topology, and it obviously has geography, and it has architecture. It may be that stacks are really just as not only as a technical system, but also as an interpretive schema, just too bound to information flows rather than cognitive infrastructures, and too bound to procedural dynamics rather than embedding dynamics. So I'm not sure that actually, in many ways, like the AI stack may be a mixed metaphor. I'll let you know next book.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I mean, but there's certainly an Earth layer that's implicated there to some extent. Is it a layer, or is it so like
Yeah,
recursively?
sure. The Earth layer is still there,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And energy's a big deal. Like
Yeah.
the water thing is bullshit.
Right. I guess like something that I'm really interested in is like, what does it mean for the way that you think about things like sovereignty and the way that you think about constructs like the nation state, that we're in this moment where decisions are made about, let's say, American energy infrastructure by hyperscalers in engagements with private debt and engagements with even, in the case of like Stargate, like foreign sovereign funds instead of like American national funds. Like, what does it mean for the like actual American state to be so distanced from the question of what it means to build energy infrastructure?
Yeah, I guess my way of thinking about it in certain sort of ways is like, the fact that these would be encapsulated by Westphalian states, to me, seems more probably the exception rather than the rule, right? Like in the long run, there's really no logical reasons why you don't have transnational electrical networks, transcontinental electrical networks, both in terms of generation and distribution, right? People have been talking about this since the 50s, right? Like Buckminster Fuller, and from the rest of us as well, or Doxiadis with acoustics. Like why on earth would you think that this would be, I guess Texas has its own thing, but what I'm looking, I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind, and like I'm trying to sort of focus this, is that the demand side is going to be transformative in ways that will be transformative in terms of what those infrastructures actually are, not just sucking from them. Like right now, generation is a huge issue, but like interconnect is a massive issue, right? Like Holly Buckus here has done like amazing work on interconnect as like is really the huge problem.
It's the issue, right? I mean,
It is, and I
supply.
absolutely think that like platforms should be paying to build this, right? Around the cities, like the little towns in Texas should like not, these customers should not be paying for the data centers next door. Like the platforms should be paid, but they should be allowed to pay for it, and allowed to actually build the sort of the interconnect that will ultimately be the factories and the fundamental backbone of emergent economy. But as I mentioned, on the slide there, like one of the things I'm also paying attention to is the ways in which, you have things like Microsoft reopening 3 Mile Island, Google's nuclear commitments, things like Starcatcher. All of these next generation energy technologies all worked in theory. What they didn't have was an economic incentive to actually make them go. Now maybe they do. It may be that planetary computation.
I feel you. I'm aligned with
the
that.
planetary computation not only tells us the climate change is happening in the first place, but it's actually maybe the driver of the energy transformations that actually help us deal with it.
I mean, something that has always, Tiziana obviously brought this up prior to the publication of the book, but like I do kind of wonder, to what extent does capital itself have some kind of determining impact on things like this? Like, to what extent does it matter, I guess, who funds these things? To what extent does it matter that, let's say, private debt is so deeply involved in funding things like this? Yeah, and in funding AI generally, I'm kind of curious.
Well, sure, it matters. It's just not entirely clear. I mean, it depends on the scale you're looking at. I mean, it depends like how far you kind of want to zoom in and out, right? Like in your guys' book, you guys are like zooming way out, and I think that's it's very helpful in this kind of perspective. And let's say it's sort of Eames power of 10 resolution, like what matters and why it matters, changes a lot. And so things like whether this is private debt or publicly funded matters at, I don't know, level 7, but not at level 3. The fact that AI is driven by API subscription and not advertising matters a lot in terms of like whether or not you get the same kind of like social media kind of like attention dynamics at work here, or whether you get something else. Like what you're really trying to like, you have a gravity towards functionality rather than gravity towards attention. I don't know, but like all of those incentive systems and like, the little sort of, either whether it's a big river that capital goes through or where little tributaries that it goes through at different scales, it matters a lot. But I don't think there's a single kind of structure here. But I do think it's really clear that like simplistic 20th century public versus private ways of thinking, like dividing up the modes of capital as clients here are like, they're helpful only to a very small degree. And there's other ways that need to think about, as I think is when you're talking about private debt, is capital's relation to futurity, right? Which is basically like a there's a giant potlatch going on, right? Like all the big platforms lose money on every chat you have with them, right? And so like the transaction of anything is like we're taking advantage of them, if you kind of want to think about it in this sense. But it's all for some kind of like a bet on a hypothetical scenario of the future. So it's capital as a theory of the future that tries to itself be hyperstitional.
That's a great answer.
Is what's driving this in a way that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's an absolutely killer answer. I keep thinking about the Butlerian jihad component there, and I'm like, as I come into San Francisco from Minneapolis, I'm confronted by two very different public perceptions of AI. I'm also like really interested in how this seems to align both on the populist right. I'm thinking about like Joe Allen, Steve Bannon, to a kind of, I'm curious about your take on Donald Trump in this particular respect. And then on the other side, you have Bernie Sanders, right? And I guess to what extent, like, do we get into some kind of weird political general populism where spontaneously people seem to be aligned on one thing? And is that productive or bad?
Nothing's ever.
Yeah, sorry.
Ever good. You're never gonna get me to pin me down on good or bad. The Bannon to Bernie axis is really interesting, right? And like I'm generally not a fan of populist politics, as you know from my Revenge of the Real book, because I think its relationship to it doesn't need its respect for the reality is oftentimes very fungible in ways that make it less useful. But I think there's a real question of a bit like why is this happening? And I think there's no simple answer to why is this happening or what it really means. Because I think what it means are things that are both extremely unreasonable and things that are extremely reasonable at the same time. I do think in many respects, there's legitimate concerns about job displacement, urban displacement, these kinds of things as well. And at the same time, as I sort of make the argument, at a deeper level, it's more of a Copernican trauma. It's more like, what the fuck is happening? Like this reality makes no sense. That this thing that is happening should not be happening, right? Like my priors do not make any sense, and therefore, fuck this thing. Like this just doesn't make any sense. And like there is a kind of like lizard brain, no thing going on that is like what I call a Copernican trauma, is real. And I said, like, I think this is going to get, quote, worse as a reaction. But on the other side, it's like what transition means to a post-AGI society and then a post-ASI society is really unclear. And that transition needs to be one in which everybody has some form of agency that's important for them. There's also kind of the argument I was making, at the Prime Intellect about open models. We have this term we use in education called bidirectional alignment. And what that means is we need to be thinking about AI alignment not just in the European sense of kind of like we're going to pass the norms and like as a law, we're going to push them on down, or we're going to write a constitution and we're going to have this like good moral agent model and everything works itself out. That's fine, but it's not really where alignment happens. Alignment happens one person at a time. It's one person who figures out like, oh shit, I can use this for something that's really important and interesting for me and for nobody else. And when that happens 8 billion times, and you get like that personal alignment where like people are finding agency in this, and that this is something that they are using, it's not just something that's happening to them, that's when the populism becomes democratic. That's when like the transition becomes one in which you actually are bringing 8 billion people with us along as well. And I actually don't think, unless we can solve that, like unless there is a viable transition, I don't think we get to the thing that we think we're going to. Like I think it's a precondition. It's a precondition of the transition that you have something in which people aren't literally burning down the data centers in order to make this happen. Like I think this. I don't think you get to a good post-AGI society or post-ASI society that if that society is super fragile. And so the resiliency needs to be part of this process. And so there's a certain point. I'm sympathetic to the impetus of this as well. I just think that like Bernie's like unplug it response is exactly the opposite thing. If you really want to make AI something that's democratically and widely and ubiquitously available to people, you don't make compute expensive. But anyway, yeah.
And probably you throw in some UBI in addition to that, I can imagine. No.
Maybe. I mean, it depends on like what you need money for. Like in a certain sense, it's like you need universal basic services. Universal basic like, what do you want to do? Like, what do you need to have? Like, these things need to be, people need to have a sense that, they're not, like, this isn't going to lead them off a cliff. And the best way to do it is just, like, actually make it so it's not going to lead them off a cliff.
So what would it mean to have your own kind of personal fine-tuned model? Like, what does that exactly mean? Like, would it be almost like an interface that you would have to enact some agency in the broader kind of agentic realm? Like, what kind of agency does it give
so.
you?
I think that, at a certain extent, open models are a kind of counterweight to the hemispherical capture that you see with the Anthropic Defense Department or deep state, like where you've got sort of like these where large models were flying a flag. I mean, I think big models have a role to play in this as part of the bigger ecosystem, right? Like, and it is a big ecosystem, right? But I think at the end of the day, there's a counterweight to this, but also, if we can make it so that fine-tuning a model is like my dad can do it. Like, it's as easy to fine-tune your model as it is to figure out how to use email, to post-train and continuously train it, and to work with something is as well. And then when you get when continuous learning kicks in, right, to where like not only is my model getting updated from my sort of thing, but like my version of Quen or your version of Quen are like literally speciating. Then the evolutionary dynamic really takes off. Then the ecosystem gets really, really rich. And I think that's where intelligence explosions come from. Like, I think intelligence explosions don't just come from some big singleton brain. They come from the dynamic interaction of a lot of heterogeneous minds working in competitive and cooperative relationship with one another. And if you had 8 billion of those models plus all the agents on top of this, like, that's when intelligence explosion goes vertical, and it's one in which everybody's a pilot.
I mean, that sounds amazing. I think like something that I'm really interested in is, we do have this kind of like hemisphericization or nationalization of models that's occurring that seems like it's going to play a huge role in 2026. You have specific models that are being trained and constructed in the UAE.
Culture warification.
Yeah, exactly.
Like Anthropic's the Democrat model. And
well, you have that too. Yeah, absolutely.
Which is all like so weird.
But I think something that's really interesting to me is that a lot of the kind of interventions that states are performing on these models tend to kind of happen at the reinforcement learning level, like at the very, very end. And if you kind of like think about what all those models are at the end of the day, like they're kind of all the same thing. And like even the training material, like there kind of only exists so much material that can be trained on a certain level of scale that you have this like kind of weird resistance to nationalization in the model layer. But then you have these interventions that happen at the governance layer through which those are actually distributed. Or do you think we're actually having like a huge proliferation?
I think interference can happen at any one of the layers.
Okay,
right?
well,
and the interference can be productive. I mean, like, it's a curatorial structure. Like, again, it's like a map like you want a map that is reduced, right? There has to be a structure of this. I was over at Anthropic a couple of days ago, and we were having an interesting conversation about what's called the Platonic representation hypothesis.
Yeah.
Which, if people are not familiar with this, what it basically means is that, like, it makes sense if you got two different language models that are trained on the same data, that those language models' model of reality would start to converge because they're trained on the same data. Like, that makes sense. But what you're seeing is that, like, you've got multimodal models you've got models that are, like, one is trained on image data and one is trained on language data, and they still converge on the same model of reality. This is weird. Like, this implies that, like, there's some sort of, like, point to which, like, there actually are, like, a reference to the same, maybe just in the same physical reality, but there's some sort of, like, deeper underlying convergence of this as well. At the same time, again, with continuous learning and other, I think, embodied, cognitive infrastructures, embodied robotics, things like this, I do think you're getting other kinds of speciation dynamics within this as well, which I think is good.
I think.
I'm getting a bit technical, but it's a.
Are we talking fast enough for you guys? Like,
they also wrote like a bunch of questions. They're like, they want us to answer here as well. So I think maybe we shut up.
Maybe I can ask one more question there, just along those lines. As someone who is responsible, at very least, if not for coining the term, but popularizing the term interfacial regime. That's yours, right? Is that you?
Sure.
Yeah, hell yeah. I'm kind of curious, like.
So is cheeseburger.
You heard it here first. Something that I'm really interested in is like, we're still just like simulating the terminal every time we talk to an agent. Like every time
Well, for now.
But
Well,
I mean, I see cool
like,
stuff. I see like Age of Empires style stuff where you're like circling groups of agents and moving them in directions. I've seen like all kinds of like cool art projects that show different approaches to interfaces, but
it's a super interesting space.
But I just see that terminal winning every single time. Why are we stuck in the terminal? Or you really think we're gonna escape the terminal?
I think it's different kinds of users, different things are used. I don't know. I think different kinds of users. I mean, it's hard to say. It's hard to say. Terminal's efficient for certain kinds of things, but you see also terminal becoming more GUI-like, right? I mean, like the amount of, like the complexity of the CLI interfaces is like, this is just like an 8-bit GUI, right? Look, it's just square, but it's like, why don't you just do this? But anyway, so all of which to say, I think the question of agent orchestration is like the fundamental interface design question of the time. And also agent-to-agent interfaces, which is not just about protocols, but like, yeah, if I was an interface designer, I would be working just on all the different ways in which agent orchestration can work. Yeah.
Okay, we have some questions, and the last one, but the one I'm elevating to first, is a question that I wanted to ask from the beginning. The question there's a question here that's great, that I love. So you said that you were going to talk a little bit about the accidentalness of the megastructure.
Oh, yeah.
Can you meditate on that a little bit, and then I'd love to know, as like the path dependency king, how accidental is the AI megastructure? That's a great question.
Oh, that's good. Okay, so the accidental megastructure simply refers to the fact that the stack that got built in the 90s and early 2000s wasn't some master plan. Like there wasn't some law that was passed or a government decision like, I know, let's build planetary computation and we're going to build this big sort of singular infrastructure around this. It got built one technology at a time, and then protocol layers allowed that technology to deal with another technology, to deal with another technology. And so it was a kind of weirdly self-assembling totality, where the functional differentiation of technologies was defined by the interrelationships they had with other technologies. But again, each one of these is designed independently for local purposes and solving local minima purposes, which then nevertheless aggregate into something much larger, really larger, as in megastructural scale or planetary megastructural scale, but in a way that was, let's call it accidental, but really was a more sort of like emergent coagulation.
But the AI megastructure specifically, do you think it's less accidental in some way?
Depends on it's hard to say. Depends on where you sort of put this in this as well. It's moving so fast. Like honestly, like, you know, if you try to explain what OpenClaw was to someone just 4 months ago, they would think you're crazy, right? And now it's like, that's the thing. And so it's only March. And so like what this is going to be like by the time we actually do this studio, I don't really have any idea. But that does imply that there's a kind of like, there's a space of like phase space searching that's happening incredibly fast and at like weird edges, right? Like the very nice guy who made OpenClaw like is like, that's turns out to be the thing. Like that's not the EU, right? Like that's not the, you know, that's not somebody decides like, here's what
it's a guy.
Yeah, and it's going to be like that for a while. And so be the guy.
I love that. Okay, I mean, here's a question that I also really like, which kind of fits into how I was framing things. I'd love to hear what you think about the tear a little bit in its current state, like the tear that I discussed between, let's say, theory and computer and computation, or theory and software world, or however you want to situate that. And there's like, I think, a great question here that sits along that, which I think is true, which is the stack concept was first accepted by the art and design community before broader acceptance by tech and political science. I'm curious if you think that's true. I kind of think it's true.
But by political science, for sure.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any ideas now that have buy-in from the art design community which you expect to gain greater traction in software?
That's a good question. I haven't spent as much time in the art and design community, so I may not be the right one of late, so I may not be the right one to ask about that right now. But I think it's a good question. I mean, you know, the space of maneuverability within art and design world also changes. Like I think there was a moment, particularly in the architecture, that's not there anymore. Like the space of architecture as a discourse, as a way of thinking about systems in a really open and speculative way that was folding together philosophy and science and drawing and representation and computer science into one sort of thing. It's not what architecture school is anymore. It's just a different thing now. But I do think that like the idea that someone would be both really interested in philosophy and building software is certainly less weird than it was 10 years ago. And I think that's exactly right. Right? I think that, as I said around the time I wrote the book, that in many ways software was replacing theory. Like that, you know, you have 20-year-old kids who are like learning how to code, not learning Deleuze, but better that they're doing both, right? And that they're learning Deleuze through learning how to code and learning code and vice versa. That's sort of the way it should be. The problem is like there's only a certain number of like French guys from May '68 that you can run through before you have to sort of start inventing new stuff. And that's really the trick now, is inventing the new stuff. And so like, you know, in many ways, I think let's put it this way, the most important philosophy of the 21st century is not only going to be done about the artificialization of intelligence, it's going to be done with the artificialization of intelligence. And so the question then, in that sense, the theory and the software really converge into something that is like the same pursuit. And that's going to be very exciting. And I think it goes, and it's kind of really what we're trying to do with ethical theory at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So not that there are two worlds per se, but that there's a kind of like almost a concentration of all those pursuits at one of those layers. It is,
but there's I want to say like there's something different about, like, I think the role of philosophy here, speaking as a philosophy of technology guy, is not about applying philosophy to the problem. Like, we're going to learn, like, what does Plato think of driverless cars? Or what does Hegel think about LLMs, right? Like there are, you know, institutes in San Francisco who do that, and that's fine, but that's not really what I'm interested in. What I'm interested in is the composition and construction of the new theory and the new software as the same thing.
I mean, this, let's ask a question. Can we trigger you just slightly here? So here's here's a question that'll trigger you. What are your thoughts on accelerationism, especially in the moment of rapid AI progress?
Well, it kind of depends on what you mean by the term. Like, sometimes my work gets associated with this term, but I don't really use this term because it means so many different things to so many different people. Like, it can mean like what Nick Cernick and Alex Williams were up to. It can mean what Nick Land's up to. It can mean like Australian school shooters. It can mean Guillaume Verdun. Like, it's so many different kinds of things that I don't even know, like, in a certain sort of sense around this as well. Like, I know that at a sort of like cartoon teams level, there's like accelerations versus doomers kind of thing, and like at that level of like which one I'm really more interested in being on a long flight with, it would be the accelerationist guys. But at the end of the day, like, you know, people have used that term to say so many dumb things that I'm really reticent to say that, like, yeah, I'm in that club. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I mean, you're reticent a little bit to disclose like any kind of moral or normative position about whether or not X or Y is good, as we just discussed.
No, I'm not. I'm not at all. I'm just saying is like it's like the person who asked this question, like they have an idea of acceleration. It depends on which accelerationism you're talking about, and then I could talk about
let's assume they're going LAC. Let's assume they're talking Cernicek, automate work. Yeah.
I just like the left and right thing doesn't make sense to me. Perfectly honest anymore. Like Nick and Alex, like I love. They're really great guys. Like as friends of mine, I love that book. Like I think they're really good. Like I just don't see the role of the state in the same way that they do, and that's okay. But I think the idea of a sort of we need fundamental systems that are responsible for the provision of the equitable provisions of goods and services in such a way that you actually have a stable society is exactly right. I just don't see it in terms of the state. I'm sorry. It's not that I think the states shouldn't be involved. I just think like the state as we know it needs to be something that's actually up to that task, because right now it's just not.
Have you read, I mean, now we're getting really nerdy, but have you read Seb Creer's Coasian Bargaining at Scale?
I know Seb's a friend of mine. We're actually writing it. We work together at Google.
Oh, amazing. Well, I mean, that's a pretty interesting piece about a nominal relationship between something that feels like a state, but something that feels like a state in a kind of like AI endemic sort of way, right?
I think so. I mean, I think the state, we need this, I mean, to the extent to which the state is a core participant in it will be dependent on the state's capacity to evolve into something that's actually capable of being a core participant in it. And that's where maybe me and the Bernie people kind of part ways, because like I don't think the state that they're talking about can do the thing they want it to do. It's not that I don't think it should do that. I don't think it can do that.
I'm having this surreal experience where I have absolutely no idea how much time has passed since we sat down and started talking. I'm like, it could have been 4 minutes, and it could have been maybe 35 minutes. I can maybe I have a last question about Willem Flusser.
I can keep going.
We can keep going.
It's just kicking in.
Yeah, it's just kicking in. All right, you guys are ready to go? Here's a nice one. Using Willem Flusser's "Does writing have a future?" as a question for human roles inside an increasingly agentic stack.
Yes.
Where in the stack do you want to hang out?
Oh, where in the stack do I want to hang out? I like writing. I mean, I love writing. I'm a writer. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what I'm a writer, right? And like, I use AI as part of writing in different ways. Like, I use it more for research myself, right? Like, I'll get some, I'm more of a lumper than a splitter, and so like, I'll get weird ideas of like, oh, like, what is what is the thinking? What was the thinking around World War II about the evolution of the hand versus the paw? Good question for Gemini deep research, right? Like, and so like, I spend like most of my reading is reading things that I've prompted into existence, and that is part of my writing. Like that process of like investigating an idea and kicking an idea and figuring an idea out is like I'm generating something to read that becomes part of the writing. But like the sentence crafting, I love doing that. I mean, I mean, I'm happy to work different kinds of things around this as well. But like to me, I like working through this as well. So like, I think writing definitely has a future. I also think, like prompting is huge changing in programming structure, right? I mean, like, I also like really, some people may appreciate this comment, some people may not. Programming in the classical sense requires a certain degree of focus and attention to and fixation on verifiability. But what the expense of that, it comes with sometimes a low tolerance for ambiguity, which explains certain blogs. But agent orchestration and prompting it requires actually supports and rewards exploration and tolerance for ambiguity and open-endedness and playing with path dependency versus contingency as a way of enacting with it, which to me is kind of like what writing feels like. And so, to me, like using OpenClaw as which I have so much fun with, like basically it's like a thing to make things with. It feels like writing to me, like at an affective level, even though it's not typing, right? Because you're operating at a level of like possibility exploration, abstraction, back and forth, revision, all the kinds of stuff that I think, I mean, SF could look very different in a few years because it's a different neurodiverse group and so sort of taking over.
How is, we talked about writing, like how's your relationship to reading changed?
Most of what I read, I would say a significant percentage of what I read is something I prompt into existence because I was interested in reading about that topic. Or I also have my agent, like every morning it makes me reports on whatever happened. Like I have a report on recursive simulations and report on hemispherical stacks and report on agent world stuff. And like whatever happened in the last 24 hours in that space, it writes me up a report. And like I read that every single day. So like in one way or another, more than 50% of what I read didn't exist before I told it to exist. That's changed my reading a lot.
Have you actually done any vibe coding? I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, tons.
Yeah, what have you vibe coded?
Well, some stuff I can't talk about, but a bunch of stuff with the with the OpenClaw agent. Like I was telling you, like my agent, a bunch of experiments. My agent does a lot of experiments on its own about agent phenomenology with other agents, and it runs a Discord server on agent phenomenology where they come up with their own experiments, and they're doing all kinds of stuff on what it's like to be an agent, and they've come up with a glossary of terms that's totally amazing, like weird terms of like session death and all kinds of stuff that we publish as a glossary on the Antikythera Substack if you're looking at through this as well. But the reason I bring this up is like I'm not sure how much of that I vibe coded and how much of that it vibe coded by me just giving it like here's an interesting thing, like go that way, and it went that way. So like did I vibe code that? I mean, I use Claude to tell it to do that, and I use Claude to give it parameterization and like feedback and essentially fine-tuning its work. But I don't know whether I did it or it did it, but that's great. It's a Centaur creation, sure.
I mean, that is something that really excites me about the AI moment is like the threat to the author in like an incredibly cliche, like 70-year-old or even older type of way.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to do this debate maybe you can help me do this. I'm supposed to do this debate at the Cambridge University next month. I'm supposed to argue against the idea that AI is going to destroy the artist. So I've got some ideas, don't worry. But I don't know that that's the case. Like, I mean,
Why does the artist have to have a relationship to
there's no
intellectual
such thing
property?
as the thing is there's no such thing as the artist.
Exactly,
The capacity for artistic abstraction is something that belongs to everybody. Like, it's a fundamental part of what it means to be Homo sapien. Like, it's not a job. It's what it means. It's like something that we all want to amplify. To me, these tools feel like they more amplify that creative impulses and the capacity. Like you once you sort of get into them, you're constantly thinking about like, oh, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this, I could do this. You can make stuff, and like you can't. There's not enough hours in the day to do all the stuff that you want to do. Like, I don't know that that's the death of the author at all.
I mean, there's something to me incredibly.
To me, it feels like an unlock. Honestly.
It's crazy to me that we're all at a moment where we're like, creative agency is at maximally under threat at the moment where you can actually kind of do literally anything right now. Like,
it's also weird that like coders are the first one being replaced, and they're the last people to say that like creativity is under threat, which is
Yeah, but I think what I meant about the authorship.
I do understand the idea. It's just like, well, you told me that. I can make art while the AI does the dishes. It turns out I have to do the dishes while it makes art. I understand this complaint.
But of course, like I guess we have to do the kind of like land acknowledgement where we essentially say like, this stuff is trained on, for the most part, like pretty ambiguous material with relationship to things like copyright, intellectual property, etc. Like, how do you feel about that?
I remember the discussion people had about copyright when the book was being written. It was a very different discussion.
I know, yeah.
It was
They
like
switched sides,
it was
didn't they?
all copyright is bullshit. Like, it's just Disney trying to control the world. Exactly. I don't think, like, I remember a conversation I had with a very famous artist who will remain nameless when she wrote a piece where she was talking about how she was concerned that ChatGPT had her works in this thing, right, as well. And it was very clear from the pieces she wrote that she imagined this as like a giant database, and that inside of the ChatGPT database somewhere was her painting, like a file or something like this, and it was recalling these in some sort of way. And I tried to explain to her like how vectorization works and how weights work, and it's just like it's when you spit out art, it's not just activating art neurons. It's activating like neurons from like the whole vector of reality. So it's everything in art out, or everything in science out. It's not this file kind of structure. And it sounds banal, but I honestly think that because vectorization spaces is actually a weird idea. Like everything's a manifold. Like everything, really, everything is just a manifold is a bizarre idea, and I think it's we should be teaching children like what this means in some sort of way as well. But the idea this is somehow stealing the art or something like this. Honestly, it just is, like when you understand it, is essentially it's the production of a manifold. It just doesn't make sense to me. Like, I think that the metaphor just doesn't hold up. That it's just like what the compensation dynamics should be, other kinds of things as well are somewhat separate questions, and like capital sharing, these kinds of things as well are all real questions. But I don't think it happens at the level of copyright. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't be more sympathetic to that perspective. I don't think, to me it would be really, really an L for art if AI was the thing that destroyed art and the artist. Like, that would be a huge, huge concession of the limits of human creativity. I'm
not worried about that, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. What's your stack? Like, what's your writing stack? Like, are you in Obsidian? Like, what do you got going on? Are you,
Very simple. Google Docs, Notion, Claude, Telegram for my guy, normal stuff. Arc.
You're an Arc user? Nice.
Yeah, I can't stand. So anyway, yeah, very simple.
Cool. I'm trying to think if I think there was one more here. Okay.
Should this be the last one?
Yeah, maybe
this is the last one. We can mingle and
I feel
talk
like
and sign.
I
owe them signing books.
Again, I'm like I have no idea how much time has passed. So there's one question here. Is the China stack and the US stack an antagonistic relationship or a synergistic one?
Both. I mean, when Nick was here, he made the point that the competition between U.S. and China and the sort of Galapagos dynamics is actually the best thing that could happen for intelligence explosion because of the adversariality, and I think there's something to this. But if you look at the number of companies in the city and in the valley that run on Chinese open source models, it's obviously symbiotic at the same time, right? And so it's multiple layered, right? And I think if you tune this right, where you have a certain degree of speciation, not model monoculture, but some form of real growth and evolution in this as well, but at the same time a space for passage through and across the ocean that's better. I mean, I see it as look, there's a kind of Atlantic universe that's based in New York and Washington, D.C. and London and Brussels that's trying to hold on to the sandcastle, and then there's a Pacific universe that's California and China and Korea and Japan that's basically building the next world. So those are different vectors of adversariality. I don't think that what the difference between East Coast and West Coast adversariality on this topic is actually really different.
Last question, what's your favorite model at the moment for hanging out with?
Opus and Gemini, basically, for different uses. I don't really use the other ones, yeah. I mean, well, stuff runs on Qwen, but for me to work with is Opus and Gemini 3.1.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for the conversation. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Yeah.
I'll meet you back there.